That's your favorite actor, Senpai Reacts, and we're gonna be watching the amazing n.SSign Love, 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 Love performance video. Love, make sure you go check out the news video that I recently did. This is one of like my favorite groups. They're really amazing, and let's watch the performance video.
이제야 나 알고만 같다 특별한 감정인걸 예전과는 달라 흑백이던 내 일상 속 네가 나타나지고 온 세상이 colorful kind of unusual 가득히 너는 날 물들여 세상에 빛나는 것들은 다 전부 널 비추는 어둠이야
You're my universe.
Look what I found. 우리 둘은 다른 점도 많아. 짜릿해 새로운 늘 특별한 세상 탐험하듯이 Never see someone like you before. 행복이 뭐냐고 묻는다면 주저없이 난 널 답할 거야. Stay with me 널 향해 뛰는 나는 walking on clouds like you are up in the sky. I show you love, 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 love. Only you 둘이서 always 함께해. Stay with me 널 향해 뛰는 나는 walking on clouds like you are up in the sky. I'll show you love, 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 love. 온 세상이 다 너로 빛나 and I love it, yeah. 온통 너야, you're my universe.
1, 2, 3, 2.
Oh yeah. 너와 나 함께한 시간 앞으로도 이어가자. Stay with me 널 향해 뛰는 맘은 walking on clouds like you are up in the sky. I show you love, 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 love. Only you 둘이서 always 함께해. Stay with me 널 향해 뛰는 맘은.
Ah, this song is so good. I love this song. Song is so good. News video. Make sure you guys go check out the news video that I direct to for this song on my channel. Amazing video. That was an amazing video. Really good. I remember I like this song because I did a lo-fi version remix of this song too. I remember the first time I hearing it, I was like, I couldn't wait for a news video for this for this song. Like it was so good. It was one of them songs that you just. It was easily one of my favorite n.SSign songs. It was like it's out there. It's one of my favorite.
함께한 시간 앞으로도 이어가자. Stay with me 널 향해 뛰는 맘은 walking on clouds like you are up in the sky. I show you love, 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 love. Only you 둘이서 always 함께해. Stay with me 널 향해 뛰는 맘은 walking on clouds like you are up in the sky. I show you love, 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 love. 온 세상이 다 너로 빛나 and I love it, yeah. 온통 너야, you're my universe.
Amazing. n.SSign love, love, love performance video. Fire song. I love this group. Love the song. 1 million out of 10. Fire song. I really like it. If you're new, make sure to subscribe, like, comment below any video suggestions you have. It's your favorite actor, Senpai Reacts, and I'll see you guys in the next video.